Once again, it is really good to be here among you again. It's been a few years since I was here more often, but it seems that I get a chance almost annually now, and that's good. This, as your bulletin noted, is the 500-year anniversary of the very first baptisms of the Anabaptist movement. And I have the privilege of being the editor for the Saskatchewan Mennonite Historian, and so I'll leave a copy of our spring issue that tells the story of the early Anabaptists, but then also describes the 15 Anabaptist-derived groups that are here in Saskatchewan. So therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and the sin that clings so closely, and let us run with perseverance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. That was the passage that Melinda read for us just a few moments ago, but it's the passage that will be the focus for our meditation today. Back on January the 21st in 1525, that's 500 years and 6 months and a bit ago, a small group of Bible students gathered in a room in Felix Manz's house in Zurich, Switzerland. They were keen students of the Bible, and they read those in both the German, which was their native language, and in the original Hebrew and Greek languages. And they became convinced that there was no scriptural basis for infant baptism, and as a result, they had not yet been baptized. And so various accounts tell us that at one point, George Blaurock, who's pictured there, fell on his knees and asked Conrad Grebel to baptize him on confession of his faith. And either Blaurock or Grebel, the accounts differ on this, then baptized the other dozen members of that little study group. Now, in the 16th century, that was an extremely radical act by some radical Bible students, people who took to heart not only the biblical passages about baptism, but also those passages about the Sermon on the Mount, the example of Jesus, Jesus' other teachings. But in that society, infant baptism was the society's understanding of how the church and state worked hand in glove. Infant baptism was what registered a baby as a citizen and ultimately as a taxpayer. Now, the state and state church were very quick to respond, and Felix Manz would be the first of that circle to be executed for his faith. He was trussed and dragged into the icy January waters of the Limmat River for what they ironically called the third baptism. And one historian has asserted that there were more Anabaptists martyred in the 16th century by other Christians than there were Christians martyred by Roman pagans during the first 3 centuries. Now, that word martyr is derived from the same root word as witness. In fact, if you read the Greek for Hebrews 12:1, it is the word martyron. So we're surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses. And what can we learn from them about faithful living, about church growth, about dealing with troublesome neighbors, about dealing with and responding to enemies? Well, So far I've been talking about Anabaptists. But you might say, well, we're not Anabaptists, we're Mennonites. Well, how did we come to be called Mennonites? Well, let me give one version of that. It was March 1531 in the city of Leeuwarden in Friesland, and the tailor Sika Frick Snyder had been arrested and sentenced to be executed in the town square. In the short 4 months since he had been himself baptized, he had gathered a congregation and impressed his fellow worker, a person we know only by the name of Hedvig's husband. Now, Hedvig's husband was also a soldier and the town drummer. And so many Anabaptist martyrs won further converts with their final words that the new regulation was that the drummer's responsibility was to beat the drum to drown out their final words. Well, this drummer was reluctant to carry out that duty, and so he decided he would imbibe a few drinks and a few more in order to try to suppress his agony. And rather than drumming, he became belligerent and made a speech in which he extolled the piety and virtue of the condemned man and named the sins of the church and authorities. The next morning, he woke up sober and remembered what he had done and fled town, never to be heard from or seen again. And we know that part of the story because Hedvig herself became an Anabaptist and shared that account with others who included it in the Martyr's Mirror, this big book, 1,150 pages. Meanwhile, as he later reported, Menno Simons, who was the parish priest in a nearby town, heard that a God-fearing, pious man named Sika Snyder was beheaded at Leeuwarden for being rebaptized. It sounded strange to me to hear a second baptism spoken about, but I examined the scriptures assiduously and meditated on them earnestly, but I could find nothing in them about infant baptism. And it was that search of the scriptures that led this former parish priest to become the itinerant leader and organizer for scattered, peace-minded Anabaptists, to the point that both enemies and friends started calling them Menno's people, or Mennonists, or Mennonites. So it may well be that we became known as Mennonites, in part at least, because the story got spread thanks to a drunken drummer. But in that story, Sika Frick Snyder, Menno, and Hedvig are all part of that great cloud of witnesses. Mennonites have been in Saskatchewan since the mid-1890s. And in the Tiefengrunt Summit Cemetery, there's a tombstone that begins to tell a remarkable story. Eastbrand Wheeler died October 1894. Now, Eastbrand and Amelia Wheeler and their family had just moved from Prussia to Rostern. And Eastbrand died shortly after they arrived. So Amelia was left as a widow in a new country to raise a family of 9, ranging in age from 6 months to 16 years. In fact, there's a Carrot River connection here because that 6-month-old, Margaret Wheeler Friesen, who's buried here in the Pine Grove Cemetery, was that 6-month-old. Well, she was by herself. She had no home, no furniture, no money. But she heard about a deserted homestead near Batoche, and there she moved with her family. And the local native people often helped them by giving them extra food. But on one occasion, in desperation, Amelia sent her boys to the local chief to ask for help. The ice across the South Saskatchewan River was breaking up, and it would soon be impossible to get to Duck Lake, to the Hudson Bay store, for provisions. Hearing of the desperate plight of this widow, the chief himself set out to risk his own life by crossing the South Saskatchewan River on the ice floes to go to the trading post to get the provisions, which he brought back to Amelia and her family. And it was probably just months later that Amelia had opportunity to return the favor. When the young fugitive Almighty Voice showed up at her cabin needing food, she shared from her meager resources. Then on May 30th of 1897, she was at the Eigenheim Church that morning for the morning service. But that was also the day that the RCMP, complete with cannons, surrounded the Poplar Bluff hideout of Almighty Voice and his companions. And Amelia noted in her journal the contrast of the joy from that service with her dismay at the tragic loss of life. Surely there must be a better way for us to live together. Surely there must be a better way for us to live together. And that better way can be informed by examples drawn from that cloud of witnesses. Now, we usually don't think about our Hutterite friends as being zealous evangelists. But in the mid-1500s, the Hutterites in Moravia were the consummate missionaries, sending out missioners often annually and bringing back converts. And usually these missioners were sent out as couples, and the women were often very effective evangelists. And they would hold these annual or every biannual missioner farewell services. And at the end of them, they would escort the missioners to the town gates, knowing that many of them would perish as martyrs. But as Leonard Gross points out in his Golden Age of the Hutterites, within that farewell service, there were points that were brought to the attention of the community. If the mission was to be successful and bring people back to Moravia, they would need to constantly keep in mind that they were to be living examples of a unity wherein life and doctrine merged. The newcomers were to be accepted with joy. Patience was to be the rule in case the incoming people didn't immediately comprehend their new vocations. There were not to be hard words such as, "Oh, you coarse Swiss, you cavilling Rhinelander, you bad Hessian." Rather, humility was called for toward everyone, for each person should consider how he had been accepted into the community with love and friendliness, and that the stranger was unaccustomed to everything, the language, the work, even the food and drink. We might be able to learn some things about church life and being welcoming to others from our Hutterite cloud of witnesses. Now, our Anabaptist faith forebears were considered to be the radical reformers. They were the left wing of the Reformation. They were radicals who were convinced that the other reformers had not gone far enough in following the teachings of the scriptures. And yet among us Anabaptists, even though we started out as radicals, there's also been a strong conservative streak. I've long been intrigued by the creative faithfulness sometimes exhibited by our more conservative Anabaptist friends, the Amish. back in 2006, major media around the world were amazed at the response of the Pennsylvania nickel mines Amish community when 5 innocent girls were shot execution style in an Amish schoolhouse. And instead of seeking revenge, the Amish community surrounded and supported the widow of the murderer. They talked openly about forgiveness. Now, there seem to be more such stories from the Amish than from other conservative Anabaptist communities. Almost every Amish household has a copy of this book, this little tome here of only 1,150 pages. It's the Martyr's Mirror. It's a collection of over 800 named and many more unnamed Anabaptist martyrs. Then each Sunday, they sing from the Ausbund, the oldest Anabaptist hymnal, and many of those hymns are ballads about faithful martyrs. And there's a powerful connection between knowing those stories about people from that cloud of witnesses and creative and courageous faithfulness. I had my own experience of the power of these stories. I grew up in a household where Sunday afternoon was adult nap time, Meadowslope, and children had 2 options. You could either nap or read quietly. Well, no way I was going to nap. I was a bookworm, though, and I had read all the books in our 1-room, 8th grade schoolhouse bookshelf, and all the books that I was interested in the Sunday school library, which was also small. But the one book remaining in the church library was this Martyr's Mirror. And so that became for me Sunday afternoon reading. Took a few Sundays. Now, I graduated from that 32-student 1-room schoolhouse to the big city high school with about 1,950 students. And the second week, they announced compulsory cadets training to be soldiers. I knew from my Mennonite teaching that I could not participate. But there didn't seem to be any other Mennonites in my class, none with Mennonite surnames that I recognize, like Bauman and Burkhart and Shantz and Snyder and Krafka and Beaver and Locker. But there was a Peter with a name that I did not recognize as a Mennonite name, Entz. Peter and I somehow found each other, and we were equally naive. And we assumed that we would be kicked out of high school for not participating. And there would go my hopes of going to high school, university, and my then dream of becoming a veterinarian. I knew how our Anabaptist faith forebears had faced faith challenges. And we would merely be kicked out of high school rather than burned at the stake. Well, Peter and I looked at the 3 vice principals, and there was Dunford and Minty, both of whom were rather vicious looking and acting. And so we went to the 3rd vice principal. And Mr. Huntsberger had us sit down, and when we explained that we were Mennonites and wouldn't want to participate, he said, well, I'm a Mennonite too. And then he explained to us what we were to do instead. We were very naive, but we were inspired. And in Hebrews 12, the apostle urges us to draw inspiration and instruction from that cloud of witnesses. Therefore, since we're surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us run with perseverance the race that is set before us. Let me share just a couple more stories that can continue to inspire and inform our faithfulness. Many of you know the story of Dirk Willems, depicted in this etching from the Martyr's Mirror. Willems was attempting to escape, and he was running across the ice, the thin ice of a deep pond. His more portly pursuer fell through and cried out for help. Now, Willems had a split-second decision to make, a decision between running for freedom and his life or turning back to rescue his enemy. And Christ's command to love our enemies inspired his response, and he turned back and rescued the enemy. And today, the small city of Asperen, which is about 70 kilometers south of Amsterdam, and it has no Mennonite church, but it has a street named after their most famous son, Dirk Willemstraat. Dirk Willemstraat. Or over in Switzerland, in the Emmental, a Mennonite preacher awoke one night to the realization that some hooligans were on the roof of his house removing the thatch. And so he said to his wife, nudging her, he said, "Workmen have come to us. We'd better prepare a meal." Not long after the breakfast was ready, he went outside and called to the men, "You've worked long and hard. Surely you are hungry. Come in and join us for breakfast." The men filed into the house, sat at the table, and somehow endured the pastor's fervent, loving blessing of them and the meal as he prayed. They filled their plates, but they barely ate. Instead, they went back outside, replaced the thatch on the roof, and quietly left. I think we've got a lot to learn from our Anabaptist faith forebears. Things to learn about evangelism and church growth, about faithful living, about dealing with problem people, even enemies. Yes, we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses. So let us lay aside every weight and the sin that clings so closely, and let us run with perseverance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. Amen.